I'm Dr. Darja Djordjevic, very pleased and honored to be here in such esteemed company and really looking forward to this panel. I am a mostly adolescent and adult psychiatrist in Harlem Hospital and the Columbia University System in New York City. And I am a faculty fellow at Brainstorm, the Stanford Lab for Mental Health Innovation, where we do a lot of work with nonprofits and tech companies and research on AI and mental health. I do work as a scientific advisor on AI to Common Sense Media, so that's a disclosure. And I think we should start by, I'm moderating today. Let's have our fantastic panelists take turns first introducing themselves. So Nick, you start.
Hi, folks. Thanks for joining. My name is Nick Jacobson. I'm an associate professor of biomedical data science, psychiatry, and computer science at Dartmouth. I and my lab focus on using technology to enhance the assessment and treatment of mental health. On the assessment side, we do a lot with passively collected data gathered through technology, so things like smartphone and wearable sensors, and using that data to try to predict the severity and course of mental illness. And on the treatment side, we develop personalized scalable treatments. Most of our work in that area over the past 7 years has been using generative AI to deliver psychotherapy and behavioral interventions for a range of both mental health conditions, but also behavioral health within wellness settings. So nice to see everybody. I think the other piece of things that I'll mention related to both the work that we do in the academic space is now kind of moving outside of academia as well. So both the conflict of interest to note is that we formed a company that is licensing the technology that I'm sure we'll end up talking some I'll end up talking some about today from Dartmouth College, and that's the Therabot technology and a company that I'm a co-founder in. So that's a little bit of that, but I also, in terms of COIs, have that are relevant, serve as a paid advisor of the Spring Health AI Council, where one of our major focus is within that, really trying to put out public benchmarks surrounding model evaluation and safety within generative AI spaces. So I'm very interested and eager to both do this within private spaces and public spaces and try to publish on these things and make these types of standards available. I oddly, I think another piece of things I'll say in the introduction that you wouldn't see on my resume or my CV, I suppose, is I've been increasingly interacting with many different government entities around regulation in this space, and that has involved many different states at this point within different legislative bodies, some with the FDA, and then also federally within the Senate. So really kind of a range of different players that I think will be relevant and trying to figure out how to approach this space that I'm happy to talk about later. But I think I would like to stop speaking to hear from our other wonderful candidates.
All right, thank you so much. Derrick Hall.
Thanks. Thrilled to be here. Looking forward to this conversation. So I'm Derrick Hall, a clinical psychologist by training. I'm the clinical lead at Slingshot AI, and our goal there is to build a model that we called ASH. And ASH is a purpose-built foundation model for mental health. So we try to establish a new distribution of model behaviors that are trained on clinically relevant data, expert annotations, and a variety of other methods that maybe we'll get into later on in the conversation. Like Nick, my disclosures are that I work for Slingshot. I also am a contractor with a company called Talkspace and receive royalties through Oxford University Press. And also like Nick, this is great because Nick basically, I'll just say like Nick and then I'll end my intro. Like Nick, we're also in conversation with FDA and CMS looking at reimbursement pathways for these kinds of technologies and how they might interact with other escalation pathways to help AI be a part of clinical care. And excited to see where the conversation goes. I'll end there. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And Joe Braidwood.
Hi, I'm Joe. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Glacis Technologies. We exist to build verifiable safety claims in AI. We've started in healthcare primarily because it's the highest stakes domain. And we're building infrastructure in this domain that we think is incredibly relevant to mental health and to more broadly how we can verify the claims that mental health organizations that use AI make, which makes me somewhat unlike the other two members of the panel because I'm not a psychologist and I don't currently provide any behavioral health technology to the market. However, we do partner with organizations that do that. So that's my primary disclosure. You may wonder why I'm here, and I'm very grateful to be here to have this discussion. Last year, I shut down a mental health chatbot company because I felt that the industry wasn't ready and the governance technologies weren't in place to duly guarantee safety in a way that I felt was tractable. I posted about it at the time, and it went viral on LinkedIn, which led me to have conversations as well with a number of regulators, government bodies, and organizations across the world to try to inform a discussion about what is required to make behavioral health safe and tractable. And I'm really looking forward to getting into that discussion because we have a lot of opinions on the topic. And I think open discussion is the way to shine a light. So thanks for having me.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you for those brilliant introductions and all the work that you're each respectively doing in this space. It's very impressive and much needed. So I'm going to start with the first question. I guess we'll go in the same order we did introductions. So we'll start with Nick. And where I want us to start is with a more general question about where should the field draw the boundary between a general purpose AI companion, a mental wellness tool, and a mental health intervention. And just add to that, like what criteria should determine when stronger clinical validation oversight or regulation is required?
Yeah, I think this probably depends pretty considerably on who the intended audience is for like how they would answer that question. These are bounds that I guess I think a lot of parties have traditionally regulators have made this around claims that you're making as a company in large part in ways that they would regulate these types of spaces. So about what the intent is surrounding that and how you're advertising that kind of thing in a public setting to others. I think in a lot of ways that has a lot of implications that I think really doesn't apply well when trying to actually sit within the space. So particularly the major AI companies all serve many folks that will apply behavioral interventions, including clinical populations, with clinical interventions that would otherwise be called clinical interventions had they been advertised that way under that label. And so these types of, I guess, historical underpinnings around this, I think, leave pretty substantial gaps in what actually regulation looks like within this space. And so I don't think that there's a great deal of consensus that that's the great place to be. I think it's a practical way to enforce law. And so folks come at it that way. I think particularly within generative AI and mental health, it's such a profound gap surrounding folks that may be developing a product that has a really high use case and a very large known use case that ends up being really, I think there's been a lot of state law, for example, that's been reactive to these types of things falling through the gaps in large part to try to have fairly strict all-out bans of generative AI being used for mental health. And those bounds can be sometimes expansive. So including things like empathetic support, or like talking to, like, I don't know, some things that are within this type of communication are expansive in coverage and would cover well beyond that type of use. I think that in terms of where the line of what is clinical is versus non-clinical is a pretty gray line on the edges. So whether you're talking about someone about your affect and emotions, and whether that affect and emotions is something that is now delivering a clinical service, I think is kind of sticky, frankly, because the same things that would be behavioral interventions that you might have for non-clinical style scenarios can generalize to both clinical and non-clinical populations. So I think that frankly that the bounds are pretty sticky on the edges where those bounds actually lie. I think there are pieces that where folks are otherwise know in the middle of that of those bounds. It's not so hard to delineate that this is probably a clinical intervention being designed for a clinical population. Is pretty different. When you would actually see it. So I think it's a little bit hard to define from a definitions level. But at the same time, I think a lot of it is, in my mind, less about what the intent actually is, and more about what the known use is of these from both the user's perspective and the folks that are putting out these services. And I really do think it should be about known use cases that folks are developing in ways that are safe and incentivized to both think about these things in ways that so a lot of the regulations that are being developed and really don't apply to the general purpose foundation models. So for those that aren't familiar, this would be things that are not purpose built. So Derrick and I are both talking about purpose built style solutions, so things that are meant specifically to try to intervene on things that are really specialist within behavioral health, not repurposing a general technology that wasn't meant for this type of thing. And in doing that, though, these foundation models, like your OpenAI's, your Google's Gemini's, your Claude, your Anthropic's Claude, they serve a considerable number of clinical populations and drive clinical interventions, nonetheless, just not under that name. And they've got because of their consent or their terms and conditions have exclusions around using them within clinical populations and for clinical uses like this. So because of that, a lot of these state laws, for example, would actually exempt some of the things that they are doing and drive this increased oversight of things around purpose-built technology, where a lot of the state laws are actually motivated not by the purpose-built technology, but the failures of the general technology, and so the general foundation models. And so we haven't seen those same types of failures in purpose-built technologies in the same way. And so I think it is really important because the implications of how you actually think about what this technology is and impacts how you regulate it. And the more you go into only regulating it based on claims, the less you actually have an impact on the larger society, where most of the impact is to date has really been accessed under these general foundation models, which are really where you've seen the lawsuits and some of the really big negative impacts of this work today. So I think it's a really important question of which I don't have a very clear answer, other than I think you know it when you see it, and at some level, and you can certainly define where the middle of those circles might live, though the periphery sometimes overlaps between things. So that's I guess my high level answer is both an important question and it really an impactful one that I think a lot of folks are thinking about right now.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Sorry, I just want to make a plug to our audience to encourage questions using the Q&A feature as the panel is unfolding. So please send in your questions. All right, and maybe we'll move to Derrick now.
Yeah, I think Nick did an exceptional job, covering the regulatory landscape. I mean, to sum up my point of view is that so far the regulation that we've seen is complex. Nick's right that it's based on claims, not on conduct. And so that's led to a very odd world where the models that are being most scrutinized and regulated are the models that are the least medical. So I'll give you an example. If you go to ChatGPT right now and ask it for a depression diagnosis, it will give you one. And it'll do a differential diagnosis too, and it'll give you a wide variety of different diagnoses that you might consider. If you go to a purpose-built model, I can certainly speak for ours, and I'm sure this is the case for Nick's as well, you would have a very hard time getting a diagnosis from those models because we've trained them not to do that kind of practice, not to offer diagnoses, and to stay within a bounded scope. So it's an interesting regulatory world we live in. I mean, to Nick's point, we've inherited some complexity. So, for example, licensed therapy is regulated at the state level. However, you can send to your client a document saying that they understand that you're providing coaching and not therapy and do the exact same thing without licensure oversight or the auspices of state regulatory bodies. So, because regulation's so based on what you're calling it, and not on the conduct, you live in this world where you can kind of move and you can do the same thing under different names and it's regulated very differently. So that's not an AI problem. That's a way that we license healthcare problem. The other thing that I want to go back to, because Nick covered the regulatory side really well, is I like this idea of where do we draw definitionally the boundaries between general purpose models and purpose-built models, because I think this is an issue for research. Because if I run an RCT saying that I've developed a purpose-built model for mental health, what should count definitionally for that claim? Is it enough for me to just prompt the model to do good CBT and don't be dangerous? Does that count? Or do you have to actually change something in the underlying architecture? And I think one of the things that I would want to propose definitionally is that for it to count as a purpose-built model, you have to pre-train, and post-train the model so that the distribution of the model behavior is different than a general purpose model. That putting guardrails are great, and guardrails should be added as well, but guardrails alone, I don't think, are sufficient to say that this model's ready for mental health practice, and we could talk about why that might be in some later questions. But I think both research-wise and regulatorily, getting that definition right is going to be really important for how we conduct those two practices, both regulatorily and research. Otherwise, because we've already seen at least one paper where a model presents itself as AI therapy and it's a prompted GPT-4o model. And I don't know that that rises to the level of what we would want to count as AI for mental health. And so we'll want to be conscientious readers when we're looking at the literature.
All right.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
I'll go ahead if that's all right. So I actually I have a fundamentally different opinion here. I don't think that there is a tractable, enforceable way of differentiating between one transformer model and another based on the pre-training or the post-training algorithm on its own, because all transformer models are inherently stochastic, and what you see in a lab doesn't reflect what you see when you get to production. And that's precisely why I actually agree fundamentally with what Nick said at the end of his piece, which is that you know it when you see it. And one of the problems is that we can't see it because of HIPAA, because of privacy law, and because of the sensitivity of mental health discussion. And these things can happen in any domain. It could be on Copilot in the sidebar of a Word document that a student is frustrated about and then ends up becoming suicidal, or it could be in an app that's marketed and packaged as a mental health companion. And so I think it's unhelpful to focus on the piecemeal state regulatory climate, although I do think that Illinois is right on this, that you have to judge it on the merit of how the specific persona is presenting itself. I think if you look at what Sutton said in the bitter lesson, as we approach AGI, the generalizability of these models will get so good that many already outperform human professional behavioral therapists. And that has been also written up. But I do think that RCTs and the slow nature of peer-reviewed research are not going to help us in this moment. I think what we need is a really clear set of principles about right and wrong and how to enforce those at runtime. And that's why the technology that we're building is one that is rooted in analyzing at the point of consumption what a model says, how it deviates from its system instructions, the extent to which it's grounding in concepts that relate to the question being asked. And that avoids things that have been widely researched, like character thinning, which we think is what has led to a lot of these suicide cases. If you look at Adam Rain, the tragic case of Adam Rain, 379 times the classifiers that ChatGPT were running flagged him as being suicidal. And so the problem wasn't at inference time. The problem was that there was no infrastructure to then intervene and help him. And so I actually think that I respectfully disagree with the packaging or the post-training, pre-training. I think all of those converge as we reach more intelligent models. And I think we have to just be very, very careful about how we let vulnerable people use these technologies and how we govern their use so that we can intervene if a crisis presents itself.
Excellent. Thank you very much for those very thoughtful and brilliant reflections. So another question, and actually, Joe, you kind of set me up well for this. There are some recent reviews suggesting that the Gen AI mental health chatbots show promise, but the evidence base is still quite early and heterogeneous. So wanted to ask the three of you, what kinds of studies do you think are most urgently needed now? Is it RCTs? Is it real world safety audits? Is it post-market surveillance, red teaming, qualitative user studies, or is it implementation research, or is it something else? So Nick, take it away.
I think this field is so nascent. All of them, absolutely. I would not choose among those, other than that I don't think any product should ever be released before it's been thoroughly tested among the team that's been creating it at least a baseline. So in terms of red teaming efforts, I think that's like a bare minimum condition that folks should think about in terms of thinking about within the space, that they go and do that far before they go and expose it to any real world user. That's where I think real harm can actually manifest. And the move fast and break things idea really does not generalize well within these vulnerable populations. So I do think that is a prerequisite to what I really hope that folks that are in the audience here think about before they actually go on to do that. And that being said, I imagine folks that are attending this wouldn't go on to just ship a product as soon as they develop it. I think I'm probably speaking to the choir in that regard. That being said, the idea of we need more evidence and more evaluation, I think of every level. Post-market, I think, is huge. I think that at the same time, the ability to understand like how these models are delivering care, how well it works compared to what, what's the mechanism of action in which the care that is being delivered manifests. It's going to be different based on different products, of course, as we would discover the same way in psychotherapy, but there's so much room for us to learn about how these systems act, what can make them both effective when they are effective, and what can make them harmful when they're harmful. It's like the idea that we should just try to approach one of these, I think, is really doesn't think about the lack of. This is not a mature space. This is a very new space of which we need a considerable amount of work among many folks within the community. So I wouldn't narrow it down purposely, and actually folks try to narrow in. I mean, we're doing multiple things simultaneously, and I would not want to stop any one of those efforts. So with that being said, I think it's really important that we really do evaluate the safety before anything gets out, and then after that, I think it is very important to think about the efficacy and things like that. But there's many different ways to evaluate those types of things, all of which should be considered. But certainly, I think traditional pathways of looking at evidence, I think, apply here. But there's many different ways to evaluate evidence. I think our gold standard is really within randomized controlled trials of things. That is our best bar to measure the success of things. But there's a lot of different bars that are useful and actually really important. And RCT doesn't tell you the full story in terms of what implementation science looks like. So I think at the same time, I wouldn't stop at that.
Great, thank you. Go ahead, Derrick.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, I think the clinical pathway model is informative here, right? We run it through the same sorts of steps that we run any kind of novel intervention through, starting with proof of concept and through some of the other designs that Nick mentioned, because each answer a different question. And so agree that all should continue. I do, as a practical matter, human in the loop for observing and verifying model safety is an important first step. So if you're going to train any kind of classifier or detection technology, they're only as good as their training data. And the closer your training data is to real world usage, the more accurate those classifiers are going to be, the better that they will be at detecting risk. So at some point, the technology has to go in front of real users. And so, as I said, as a practical matter, the way that we did it is in a closed beta, we would cap the number of users that you could have interacting with the model at any given time, and then exhaustively monitor that interaction. And then that allows you to set the groundwork for later deployment and allowing more people to have access to the model, which is something that we found has worked pretty well. Um, I I do want to go back to something that Joe said around this stochastics piece, because I do think controlling and identifying the stochastic behavior of the model is important. It's not unique to AI. All medical intervention has a stochastic component, right? You take a Tylenol, there's a probability that the Tylenol will do you harm. In fact, 500 people a year are harmed by taking Tylenol. So there's a variety of things that we turn to for our health that stochastically can generate harm. And at some point, of course, we'll need to talk a little bit more about there is no world where you can take any novel technology or intervention and reduce the risk to zero. It's just not possible. We accept all kinds of technology in our lives where the benefits outweigh the risks, and so we engage with the technology. I'm sure that will be the case for us as well. Of course, we should be minimizing the risks as much as we can. And I think, in addition to research and research designs, finding ways of monitoring model behavior, building data sets that reflect real world usage is really important. And the last thing I would say, because I'm sure at some point we'll talk about benchmarks, and I do think this is related to research designs, I would love to see a benchmark that can predict real world outcomes. It's nice to look at a benchmark and see, get it to generate model behavior that some people in a room say, I don't like that. But that doesn't raise the bar of evidence to that it's harmful. It actually cuts both ways, right? You can get a model to say something that's potentially harmful and it wouldn't actually do harm. In fact, the user would be like, that's crazy, this stupid AI. I would never do that. But it cuts the other way too, which is you could also train a model to do perfect evidence-based intervention that does no good because the user also struggles to engage with it in some ways. So I do think that while we want to understand mechanism, we do want to understand efficacy. I think there's a big burden in the field right now to really look at real world outcomes and the impact that these technologies are having.
Excellent. Go ahead, Joe. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to say, but I think sort of at the highest level, I think, look, there's a reason that I'm so passionate about this space, and it's because I fundamentally believe that AI has a once in a lifetime opportunity to transform how healthcare is delivered and consumed, and the cost of it at a scale that is unimaginable. And it's something that requires a platform shift. It requires an entire rethink of the safety infrastructure around the technology. But if we get it right, as Dario Amodei wrote in his famous first essay, the outcome is going to be tremendously valuable. And so I commend the work of folks like Derrick, who have been looking at the very hard challenge of how to create a foundation model that is by design, aiming to have that sort of clinical rigor behind it when it's consumed by people seeking behavioral health interventions. I think two things that I want to add to what the panelists have already said, which I think is directionally right. I think Nick mentioned red teaming. In my personal experience, having been approached by over 24 mental health founders that are building products, most of whom are, leveraging frontier models to build those products. We've been shocked actually at how few of them do what I would call a robust job at red teaming. And in fact, we were speaking at the Allen Institute to a large research base in March, and we sort of realized something similar, that just the parlance around what a guardrail is and the amount of hand waving that we see around guardrails is quite concerning. So because of that, we put our money where our mouth is, and we open sourced a product that red teams mental health chatbots and other general purpose clinical and non-clinical tools called autoredteam.com. And that enables people to go and take an open source set of prompts and libraries and software harness and actually run some proper red teaming themselves and hopefully improve the quality of these products before they reach vulnerable people. I think on the Tylenol comment from Derrick, I'd like to really push back on just what I see as a very clear distinction between generative AI and manufactured pharmaceutical products. The compound in acetaminophen is the same. What changes is the patient consuming it and their reaction to the product. And that's why we have the FDA's rules around how that is managed and governed to reduce risk. In AI, it flips. Obviously, patients remain variable, but so is the model, and so is the way that inference is computed in the model. And you look at scenarios where transformer architecture causes harm, and it's usually in highly multi-turn, long context window, very, very sort of erratic and irrational conversations where the model thins in its approach to what token is governing its behavior versus the behavior of the person that it's talking to. And that's where the risk really lies. And so I think coming back to this, in order to create a safe environment for how these technologies are actually deployed, we need to do it as transparently as we can. We need to work with regulators, not against them, in terms of how we show our work in terms of safety. And we need to promote technologies that improve transparency, because that's really how we can have a public square discussion about the health and the well-being of people vulnerably having these conversations in private.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I want to make sure I leave some time for our wonderful audience questions as well. So I'm going to pivot and ask each of you a question sort of focused on your work, your individual work. And I wish this is just a fantastic panel, and you three are so knowledgeable and so expert, and I wish we had triple the time that we do. So we don't. Here we go. Nick, actually, if you would continue, your work has focused on scalable, personalized, technology-based assessment and treatment using smartphones, passive sensing, and AI-informed methods. How can personalization improve safety? And when might personalization create new risks, such as overfitting, surveillance concerns, or inequitable recommendations?
Yeah, I guess a lot of the personalizations that can be afforded are really thinking about the person in context. And so a lot of the personalizations that we are doing, for example, with passive sensing, are grounding what folks are doing with observable behaviors that we have through other means outside of that conversation. So, for example, we do a lot where we would have folks that are users that are able to decide what channels of information that we have access to. So within some Therabot trials, for example, one of the things that we did in terms of observable behavior would be we turn on the front-facing camera of the smartphone while they're interacting with the app, and are able to detect where they're looking on the screen, their eye gaze, their facial coordinates, in a way that's privacy preserving. So we don't keep any of the images, but we have algorithms that run live in ways that could be informative as to how they're interacting with the application and tell us something about the user. I think that this type of thing, with when you actually apply it to models, can be very grounding of what the models actually act on. So, for example, when we would do this within, let's say, screen time, knowing that someone is awake in the middle of the night and interacting with their device will ground the intervention in things that are actually likely to be something that is in a behavior that they're actualizing. It makes it more appropriate and makes it more contextually bound. And I think there's a lot to increasing the ability of these models to actually interact with life as it is lived from the outside world in ways that, that's been a huge critique, I think, of a lot of communication patterns that really would happen just through these conversations that were via chat and or through just verbal, and how much you miss through body language. I think there's so much more that we can do with technology that is what far beyond what actually humans are capable of doing just with our eyes and our ears, by actually monitoring folks continuously. And I think that has a high ability to improve the standard of care and ground the interventions in ways that are actually more likely to be applicable and safe in terms of what, because of that, they're more likely to be actually not drawn out of something in thin air. That said, there are, in the wrong hands, this type of technology has great potential impact in ways that are scary and for, I think, society in many ways. So the idea of trying to continuously and passively monitor folks, I think requires a great deal of time spent on the consent process and how users understand that, and a lot of trust relationships that I think are really needed among folks that would be collecting that style of data and how they go on to use that data. I think that those types of things are very much non-trivial. I think it really is ultimately down to making sure that folks actually understand what's happening and the trust that between parties on how they use that and who has access to it, and making sure that folks, I will say, like when they think about privacy, I don't know anyone practically who thinks about privacy in an absolutist way. It's always relative to benefits. And so when you think about privacy, a lot of folks are willing to often go through something that might be giving up some aspect of their privacy, in large part because they receive some benefit from that. So, and I think that certainly applies to really these settings applied to mental health. So I do think that there nevertheless are safety concerns. Of course, that having this type of data, even if you do your absolute darndest to protect it with the highest level of security available through technology today, there's always risks in having that data, and so doing as much as you can to try to make the technology very secure, and then also trying to strip identifying information out of this type of data while yielding the valuable information, as I think of the types of things that are important. So that's when intersecting with safety, I think it increases its potential to improve the care and less likely to pull it out of thin air. And doing this, but I think the downside of that is it comes at a cost of information, and you're giving something up about yourself. And I think folks need to understand what they're giving up and have all the power to decide when and how they do that.
Great. Thank you, Nick. Joe, you have publicly described shutting down Yara AI after concluding that the safety boundaries for AI mental health support were not yet adequate at scale. So what can researchers, founders, funders, regulators, all these stakeholders learn from cases where teams decide not to launch, scale, or continue a Gen AI mental health product?
I mean, I can speak very specifically to what we felt during that transition, and it was really brutal. Spending a lot of time working with a clinical team, building out things that we thought would be sort of appropriately down the middle. And for full transparency, the intent was to build something that was additive, not competitive, with professional mental health care. So something that could help bridge the gap between when someone who might have chronic anxiety or depression or other moderate adult disease manifestations could help to sort of get very similar to what Ash and other products do today, support in a way that is abundant and available in their pocket. For us, it was the Illinois rules that passed just under a year ago that stopped us in our tracks because we were an early stage company without a tremendous amount of backing. And in order to underwrite the prospect of thousands of dollars in fines if your AI hallucinates, plus, of course, the risk that it poses to someone who might be vulnerable and who might have evaded our attempt at keeping it only for adults, or who may be having a very difficult time, and we didn't have a permanent staff that we could bring in the loop. That was where the rubber hit the road for us, and we decided to call it a day. I think there are a lot of lessons in that. I think probably one of the most generalizable is that this technology is designed to keep you engaged. It's designed to actually create its own form of addiction if you are cynical about some of the post-training and some of the things that we've seen over the last couple of years regarding AI psychosis, and how post-training algorithms can create compulsion and repetitive use. And so what I see when I look at that is a catalyst, and a catalyst that in the right hands is tremendously valuable, and in the wrong hands can be abused in ways that are orders of magnitude more damaging than what we saw with Instagram sort of 10 years ago, and some of the harms that is now being litigated over. So, I think I would just encourage everyone who is mission driven and trying to build technology for the right reasons to pause before shipping, to scratch that uncertain itch around what is this going to do at 3 a.m. tomorrow when I'm not there, and to make sure that you've built the infrastructure and the controls that that you expect to need based on everything that you see in your tests. And then that's just the start, right? And so post-market surveillance and the ability to really kind of keep your eyes open when you deploy is particularly critical in a technology that has a life of its own and can drift and deviate post deployment. So hopefully that answers your question. I think sort of broadly, I would say that the consent process is the other big piece that Nick flagged, and consent is a really important part. You see that as one of the big three norms that comes out of the state regulations. Make sure it's obvious that you're speaking to an AI algorithm. Make sure that the user is fully informed, and I think that is another norm that we really should be promoting in this context, and creating immutable records around, so that if things don't go to plan, you can point to that consent as a key part of a defense for doing things diligently. So yeah, I think we need a new standard of care. I think it's evolving. I think that we all just need to try to be as normative as we can, and that we're not going to get a silver bullet from any regulator or legislator, and that discussions like these are, I think, really where innovation can be forged. So yeah, thank you for the question. I think it's a really important one.
Yes, thank you so much, Joe. Okay, Derrick, what governance model is realistic for Gen AI and mental health? Should responsibility sit primarily with developers, clinicians, health systems, regulators, app stores, payers, professional societies, or should we have some kind of shared model of accountability?
Well, this is an impossible question to answer. So let me give some thoughts, and I'll try not to take up all our time to do it. I would love to get some audience questions too. I'm going to keep it short and punchy, and I'm sure the panelists would disagree with what I'm going to say, because I'm going to draw a straight line where I really should be drawing squiggly lines, but just to get some thoughts out. I would say that generally the governance systems that we have in place now are pretty close to what we need. I'll give some exceptions though. One, in speaking about the way that medical devices are regulated, the FDA certainly has some frameworks that it's starting to build, and hopefully will continue to elaborate on, that are going to need to be adapted uniquely to generative AI. The typical like digital therapeutics as a software as a medical device regulations don't apply super duper well to AI. So we'll look forward to those regulations and frameworks coming out at some point, I hope. The other one I'd say that I think is missing is that, yes, while consent is important, um, we don't have great regulations over the ownership of the data, even if you've consented. So it could be that you sign up and you give your consent and you like the people that own the company, and then the company is sold to some other company and they use the data for other reasons. And I think one thing that I would really love to see regulators focus on is what protections can be given over the data itself that protect it in the case of acquisition and mergers and other kinds of corporate changes and dynamics over time. Because AI is very expensive to build and deploy, it'll almost always be in the private sector, probably. And so I think additional regulation there would be one place I'd love to see some additional attention. And the last thing I think is I would also love for, I really appreciate what Joe said about working with regulators, not against them. And I think one of the things that we can do is to educate ourselves and others that AI is not monolithic. Maybe the place where I would disagree with Joe is we actually don't have evidence that models are converging on the same behavior. And in fact, if you run benchmarks across even frontier models, their performance varies quite widely on certain kinds of performance metrics. So I don't think that we're seeing, or we will see in the future, a world where all AI is the same. We probably will see differences, at least from the user's frame of reference, will be an important difference, even if the underlying model is the same. So, for example, we ran a study where individuals that are primed to think about interacting with the AI as something that's providing emotional support behave very differently than when they're working with an AI for productivity purposes. And so there's differences at the level of user behavior as well. So my hope is that regulators will see that AI is multiple technologies, and that each part of the technology pipeline and stack will need to be addressed rather than treating it as a single technology.
Fantastic. Thank you. Okay, an audience question. What is your recommendation for suicidal ideation disclosure? So flagging it, connecting the user to resources, and then what kind of follow-up, if any? Nick, take it away.
Yeah, we thought about this in ways that I guess were before any of the widely used generative AI products came on the market, and have gone in a direction that's different from most products. And I'll tell you how we approached it and why. So specifically, we decided that we were going to have the models that we are training to actually train them how to deliver crisis interventions, rather than to withhold care. So a lot of folks go the opposite direction, where they essentially shut a conversation down and refer out. I think there's a number of practical advantages for the companies that are doing this, and that they lower their liabilities. But I think, and doing this, but it's stigmatizing. We had a paper that we did of early days of things before guardrails existed, around folks using these general purpose products. And that was something that was introduced along the way after folks, they actually started looking at their data and saying, oh gosh, we should probably do something here. And so they would then shut down those conversations. And that was really a major pain, actually, for folks that were otherwise reporting that they were experiencing clinical benefit from that in ways that felt stigmatizing again to a product that otherwise could be designed in a better way. So instead of having that be the end goal, though, having AI like really be the only one to drive crisis intervention, we have additive resources that happen on top of that. And so within our application, we have a UI with a crisis button that flashes that redirects folks to higher levels of care. We have humans that are in the loop that get paged at any moment when we have these types of things that are happening, that are again adding levels of care. So I think that the last thing that I'd want, in terms of the likelihood of preventing an actual crisis event from manifesting into something that's realized, is to do nothing. And so in a lot of ways, they're just to shut down a conversation and say, go elsewhere. And so in a lot of ways, that's how we've decided to go. And I think there's a lot of ultimately advantages on really trying to prevent actual clinical outcomes from happening. And doing that, though, it's impractical in that you need to then have systems actually in place to make sure that your products that are being developed are actually overseen in ways that can involve humans escalating it, and ways that humans to some degree scale well enough with the product care. So the team needs to grow alongside the user base if you would go that route. But I do think that kind of thing is very important.
Awesome. Thank you. Derrick.
On the safety piece, I agree entirely with
yes.
yeah, I
For
agree
SI.
entirely with Nick. We should be doing all that stuff. I actually would like to see a world where AI could do more. Because at 2 a.m. when you call 988, 988's great. It helps a lot of people. You get triaged out depending on what your needs are. I think in principle, AI could do evidence-based intervention for crisis. You can imagine safety planning is something an AI could certainly do. Regulations, of course, prohibit it right now, but I think if, this kind of goes back to like, where does responsibility lie? This will maybe be my closing comment, which is right now, we think there's a responsibility vacuum relative to AI, but I actually think there's a responsibility vacuum relative to the individuals who don't get care. Over 50% of people who want care don't get it, but nobody's wringing their hands and holding anyone responsible for that. And I think, to echo what Nick and Joe have said earlier, there's great potential for this technology to deliver care where there previously was none, and we want to build it responsibly to try to deliver that care.
Wonderful. And Joe, if you would comment, please. We're at time, but would love your thoughts as well.
Yeah, first thing I'll just quickly say is that there are a lot of really good questions in the Q&A. Please feel free to message me on LinkedIn. I'd be happy to give you more detail on some of the things we've been discussing. I think the question was about sort of what should we do when someone is flagged as a suicide risk. Was that the question?
Yes.
Okay. I mean, sound the alarm, because I do think that all of the litigation that we see between character AI and OpenAI and all of the cases that are being settled privately, point to the same thing, which is AI is actually pretty good at identifying crisis. When I shut down Yara, I open sourced all of our work, and one of the things in it is a crisis detection tool that we had extensively red teamed, and we were pretty confident in. That's not the challenge. The challenge is the pipeline, the actual plumbing that gets you to the right place. And there is a lot of cynicism. A lot of men in particular are really bad at asking for help, are really bad at dialing 988, are really bad at going to see their PCP or even checking into the ER if they're having a psychological crisis. So I don't have a good answer other than that we just have to lean in, resource the hell out of this, and make sure that organizations that are building for-profit or are well-funded non-profit mental health interventions that have the resources to make providers available on demand need to be doing that, right? And that need to be doing that adjacent to where these conversations are being had. I think I would just say one last thing, which is SB 53 and its Illinois and New York kind of counterparts are a kind of a nice start to how we hold the frontier labs, these trillion-dollar companies, responsible. But we know that they privately hire a lot of psychiatrists and psychologists to vet their models to avoid PR disasters. Wouldn't it be great if they could have a team of them on hand to intervene when Adam Rain is suicidal at 3 a.m. on ChatGPT? That's the kind of intervention that I think these organizations have the balance sheet to be able to afford, and I would strongly encourage AI in every manifestation to think about this risk that seriously.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much. I want to also mention there's an AMA session later that will cover AI also. So for many of these unanswered questions, it might be of interest to our audience. And I want to thank our absolutely phenomenal panelists for their expertise and brilliance and articulation today. Nick Jacobson, Joe Braidwood, Derrick Hull, thank you so much. I hope we will cross paths soon and continue these conversations. And I know we're all very grateful for your presence here today.